I'm Marcus Sullivan, 42, and I just walked out of federal prison after serving 5 years for tax evasion, a crime I didn't even know I was committing. While I was learning to survive behind bars, my trusted accountant of 15 years, David Kellerman, was living it up in Vegas penthouses, buying luxury cars, and funding his gambling addiction with the $2.3 million he embezzled from my construction business. The man I paid $80,000 a year to keep me out of legal trouble had systematically destroyed my life, framed me for his crimes, and testified against me in court. But here's what David doesn't know: prison taught me patience, and I've spent every day of the last 5 years planning my comeback. Today, I'm about to show him what real justice looks like. Like and subscribe if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely. Let me take you back to 2010, when life was good and trust came easy. Sullivan & Sons Construction was pulling in $5 million annually, and I was on top of the world. My dad had started the company in 1985, and I'd built it into something he never could have imagined. We had contracts with 3 major developers, a crew of 45 skilled workers, and a reputation that opened doors across the tri-state area. That's when Tom Bradley, my buddy from the country club, introduced me to David Kellerman. Tom swore by him, said David had saved his restaurant chain from financial ruin and turned his books into a thing of beauty. You need someone like David, Tom told me over beers, someone who understands business, not just some bookkeeper counting pennies. The first time I met David in his downtown office, I was impressed. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, mahogany furniture that screamed success, and a wall full of certificates and awards. David was immaculate, perfectly pressed suits, gold cufflinks, and a handshake that conveyed confidence and reliability. He spoke my language, understood the construction industry's cash flow challenges, and promised to streamline everything. "Marcus," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "you're an artist with concrete and steel. Let me be the artist with your numbers." I should have paid attention to the red flags. David's office was too nice for a small-town accountant. His watch, a Rolex Submariner, cost more than most people's cars. When he mentioned his weekend in Atlantic City, I laughed it off as someone enjoying the fruits of his success. When he talked about his system for maximizing tax advantages, I heard opportunity, not warning bells. The business partnership agreement I signed that day was supposed to protect me. David would handle all financial matters, tax preparation, payroll, and strategic planning. In return, he'd receive a generous retainer of $80,000 annually, plus bonuses tied to cost savings he achieved. It seemed like a bargain for someone of his caliber. Within months, David had transformed my chaotic bookkeeping into something that looked professional. Monthly reports arrived on time, taxes were filed without drama, and my stress levels dropped significantly. Sarah, my wife, noticed the change immediately. "You're sleeping better," she said. "David's a godsend." David integrated himself into every aspect of Sullivan & Sons. He recommended new banking relationships that offered better rates. He suggested investment strategies for our surplus cash. He even advised on equipment purchases and employee benefits. Gradually, I handed over complete financial control, signing documents David prepared without reading them carefully. "Trust me, Marcus," became his favorite phrase. "This is what you pay me for." Looking back, I can see how methodically David gained access to everything. First, he needed to be a signatory on accounts for efficiency. Then he required access to our digital banking for real-time monitoring. Finally, he convinced me to give him power of attorney for routine tax matters. I trusted him completely. In 15 years of marriage, I'd never trusted anyone the way I trusted David Kellerman. He wasn't just my accountant, he was my financial advisor, my strategic partner, and what I thought was my friend. The irony is suffocating now. While I was building a business empire, David was systematically destroying it from within. Every handshake, every reassuring smile, every "trust me" Marcus was part of an elaborate performance designed to rob me blind, but I didn't know that yet. In 2010, David Kellerman was my salvation, the professional who would take Sullivan & Sons to the next level. I had no idea I was signing my own death warrant. Between 2015 and 2018, while I was focused on the biggest expansion in Sullivan & Sons history, David was orchestrating the perfect financial crime. I was busy securing contracts for 2 major residential developments and a commercial complex that would have set us up for life. What I didn't know was that David was using my success as cover for his systematic theft. The falsified tax returns he prepared during those years were masterpieces of criminal creativity. David created an elaborate web of shell companies, Holdings LLC, S&S Management Corp., and Sullivan Development Partners, all with legitimate-sounding names that appeared to be subsidiaries of my business. These phantom entities allowed him to move money around like a magician performing sleight of hand. Here's how his scheme worked. David would inflate our expenses by creating fake invoices from these shell companies. A $50,000 equipment purchase would become $150,000 on paper, with the extra $100,000 going directly into accounts he controlled. He'd bill us for consulting services that never existed, equipment rentals from companies that were just post office boxes, and subcontractor payments to crews that were never hired. The beauty of his plan was that it looked legitimate on the surface. Every fake expense had proper documentation, invoices, contracts, even fake email chains he'd create using multiple accounts. When I'd occasionally ask about a large expense, David would pull up these fabricated records and walk me through them, with the patience of a teacher explaining math to a child. "You're too busy building this empire to worry about the paperwork, Marcus," he'd say. "That's why you have me." Meanwhile, David was living like a king. His social media posts showed him at high-end Vegas casinos, staying in suites that cost more per night than most people make in a month. He'd post photos of himself at poker tables with stacks of chips, calling it his weekend stress relief. When I'd see these posts, I'd think, good for David. He works hard and deserves to enjoy himself. I was such a fool. The stolen money funded more than just gambling. David bought a $200,000 Maserati, a $150,000 boat, and a vacation home in the Bahamas. He justified these purchases as business investments or gifts from grateful clients. I never questioned where a small-town accountant got the money for such luxuries because I trusted him completely. The tax returns David filed on my behalf during those years were ticking time bombs. He'd report massive losses that didn't exist, claim deductions for fake expenses, and hide income in ways that would eventually trigger audits. But David had calculated every move. He knew that when the IRS came calling, the evidence would point directly at me. In late 2018, the bomb finally exploded. I was on site at our biggest project when my phone rang. Sarah's voice was shaking. "Marcus, there are federal agents at the house. They want to talk to you about tax evasion." My first instinct was to call David. He'd handle this, just like he'd handled everything else. But when I reached him, his tone was different, colder, more formal. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," he said. "I've been keeping detailed records of everything. If there are problems with your taxes, I have documentation showing that you made all the decisions." That's when I realized something was terribly wrong. David wasn't offering to help, he was positioning himself as a witness against me. The IRS audit revealed the scope of the fraud. According to their calculations, I owed $1.2 million in back taxes, penalties, and interest on income I'd never actually received. The money had been stolen, but the tax liability was mine because my name was on the falsified returns. David had played a chess game where I didn't even know I was a piece on the board. Every move he'd made over those 3 years was designed to create a paper trail leading back to me, while keeping himself in the shadows as the helpful accountant who'd been following orders. As I sat in that first meeting with IRS investigators, looking at boxes of evidence that painted me as a criminal mastermind, I finally understood the depth of David's betrayal. He hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my identity, my reputation, and my future. The falsified tax returns were David's masterpiece, and I was about to become his greatest victim. The FBI raid warrant arrived at 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March 2019. I know the exact time because I was staring at my bedroom clock when the pounding started. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor or the familiar rhythm of a delivery. Driver it was the aggressive, urgent hammering that could only mean one thing. "Federal agents, open up." Sarah bolted upright beside me, her face pale with confusion. Our kids, Emma and Jake, were getting ready for school when our front door practically exploded with activity. Through the bedroom window, I could see black SUVs lining our street and agents in tactical gear surrounding the house. My hands shook as I pulled on clothes, my mind racing through possibilities. This had to be a mistake. Maybe they were looking for someone else in the neighborhood. Maybe it was about one of my subcontractors. It couldn't be about me. I'd never done anything wrong. The lead agent, a stern woman named Detective Rodriguez, showed me the warrant as uniformed officers spread throughout my home. The document was thick, official, and terrifying in its specificity. They were searching for evidence of tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. My name was at the top in bold letters. "Mr. Sullivan, you're under arrest for federal tax evasion and conspiracy to commit fraud. Emma was crying in the hallway, still in her pajamas, watching strangers rifle through our family photos and personal belongings. Jake, 17 and trying to be strong, put his arm around his sister while glaring at the agents with teenage defiance. Sarah stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, clutching her coffee mug like it was an anchor in a storm. There's been a mistake, I kept saying. I pay my taxes. David handles all of that. David Kellerman, he's my accountant, he can explain everything. Detective Rodriguez exchanged a look with her partner. Mr. Kellerman is the one who brought this to our attention, sir. He's been cooperating with our investigation for the past 8 months. The world tilted sideways. David had been working with the FBI for 8 months, while I'd been trusting him with everything. He'd been building a case against me. That's impossible, I said. David's my friend. He's been my accountant for 9 years. He would never. Mr. Kellerman has provided us with extensive documentation of your fraudulent activities. Detective Rodriguez continued. Bank records, falsified invoices, recordings of conversations where you discussed hiding income. He's been very thorough. Recordings. David had been secretly recording our conversations. Every meeting in his office, every phone call about business decisions, every casual chat about finances had been evidence-gathering sessions. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't process it as they handcuffed me in my own driveway. I saw neighbors peering from their windows and cars slowing down to stare. Mrs. Patterson from next door had her phone out, probably recording everything. In a matter of minutes, my reputation in the community was destroyed. The drive to the federal building was surreal. Detective Rodriguez sat beside me, reviewing the charges while I tried to understand how my life had imploded so completely. According to the FBI, I had systematically evaded taxes on $2.3 million in income over 3 years. The evidence against me was overwhelming: bank records, email communications, and witness testimony from David himself. Mr. Kellerman painted quite a picture, Detective Rodriguez said. According to him, you were obsessed with avoiding taxes and pressured him to find creative ways to hide income. He says he warned you repeatedly that your schemes were illegal, but you threatened to fire him if he didn't comply. Every word was a lie, but David had apparently told these lies so convincingly that federal agents believed them completely. He'd positioned himself as the reluctant accomplice, the honest accountant forced to break the law by his demanding client. At the federal building, they processed me like any other criminal: fingerprints, photos, and a humiliating strip search. I kept expecting David to appear, to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, to use his influence to get me released. Instead, I learned that he was already scheduled to testify before a grand jury the following week. My first phone call was to a criminal defense attorney recommended by a friend. The second was to Sarah, who was crying so hard she could barely speak. The neighbors are all outside, she whispered. The news van's just arrived. Emma's locked herself in her room, and Jake wants to fight everyone. Marcus, what's happening? How is this real? I couldn't answer her because I didn't know myself. 24 hours earlier, I'd been a successful businessman with a solid reputation and a bright future. Now I was sitting in a federal holding cell, charged with crimes I didn't understand, betrayed by someone I'd trusted more than my own brother. The FBI raid warrant had shattered more than just my front door. It had destroyed everything I'd built, and everyone I loved, and David Kellerman, the man I'd paid to protect me, had been the one holding the sledgehammer all along. The trial began 6 months later, and I'll never forget the moment David walked into that courtroom. He looked exactly the same: perfectly pressed navy suit, confident posture, that same reassuring smile he'd given me 1,000 times. But now, that smile was directed at the prosecution team, and those confident eyes avoided mine completely. My attorney, Richard Morse, had warned me this would be difficult. David's testimony is devastating, Marcus. He's got recordings, documents, and a story that makes you look like a criminal mastermind. We need to prepare for the worst. The prosecution's opening statement painted me as a greedy businessman who'd exploited a naive accountant's trust. According to their narrative, I'd pressured David into creating fraudulent tax schemes, threatened his livelihood when he expressed concerns, and manipulated him into participating in my crimes through intimidation and financial coercion. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prosecutor Janet Walsh began. Marcus Sullivan is a man who believed the rules didn't apply to him. When his accountant, David Kellerman, tried to keep him honest, Mr. Sullivan made it clear that honesty was a luxury he couldn't afford. Then came David's testimony, and it was a masterclass in calculated deception. He took the stand looking nervous and reluctant, like a man forced to betray a friend for the greater good. His voice shook slightly as he was sworn in, a perfect touch that made him appear genuinely conflicted about testifying. I tried to talk Marcus out of these schemes, David said, looking directly at the jury. Every time he'd come to me with another plan to hide income or inflate expenses, I'd warn him that we were crossing legal lines, but he'd always say the same thing. David, that's what I pay you for. Find a way. The recordings David played in court were devastating because they were real conversations taken completely out of context. When I'd said, "Just handle it, David, that's what I pay you for," I'd been talking about routine tax preparation, but played in a courtroom, with David's interpretation, it sounded like I was ordering him to commit fraud. David had been recording me for over 2 years, capturing fragments of conversations that could be twisted to support the prosecution's case. He'd ask leading questions during our meetings, baiting me into responses that would sound incriminating when replayed later. Marcus was obsessed with minimizing his tax burden, David testified. He'd constantly ask me to find new ways to hide income. When I'd explain that certain strategies were illegal, he'd get angry and remind me how much he was paying me. Every word was a skillful distortion of reality. Yes, I'd wanted to minimize taxes, what business owner doesn't? Yes, I'd relied on David's expertise, that's why I hired him. But David transformed normal business conversations into evidence of criminal conspiracy. The most damaging moment came when David broke down crying on the stand. "I'm so sorry, Marcus," he said, looking at me for the first time during his testimony. "I should have been stronger. I should have reported this earlier. I was scared of losing my business, my reputation. I thought I could talk you out of it." It was a breathtaking performance. The jury saw a man tormented by guilt, forced to testify against someone he'd cared about. They had no idea they were watching a sociopath who'd spent years planning this exact moment. My defense team tried to present the truth that David had controlled all financial aspects of my business, that I'd signed documents without reading them because I trusted him completely, that the real criminal was sitting at the prosecution table playing the victim. But we had no recordings, no smoking gun evidence. Just my word against David's elaborate fiction. The jury deliberated for 3 days. I spent those 72 hours pacing my hotel room, alternating between hope and despair. Sarah had filed for divorce 2 weeks into the trial, taking Emma and Jake to her mother's house in California. The stress of the media attention, the public humiliation, and the financial ruin had destroyed our marriage. When the verdict came back, I was standing beside Richard when the foreman read those life-destroying words, "Guilty on all counts." The judge sentenced me to 5 years in federal prison with restitution of $1.2 million, money that David had stolen but that I was legally responsible for returning. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, I looked one last time at David, who was shaking hands with the prosecutors and accepting their congratulations. He'd won. Completely and absolutely. He'd stolen my money, destroyed my family, and sent me to prison, all while positioning himself as the hero who'd helped bring a criminal to justice. David's court testimony transcript would haunt me for years, but it would also become my roadmap to justice. Every lie he'd told under oath was now part of the official record, and lies have a way of unraveling when someone has enough time and motivation to pull at the threads. Federal Correctional Institution McKean sits in the mountains of Pennsylvania like a concrete monument to broken dreams. When the prison transport bus pulled through those gates on September 15, 2019, I became inmate number 47,291, just another number. In the federal system's vast bureaucracy of punishment, the intake process stripped away everything that had defined Marcus Sullivan. They took my clothes, my wedding ring, my watch, and even my dental floss. Every personal item was catalogued, photographed, and stored away until some distant release date that felt like it might never come. The prison intake form I signed was more than administrative paperwork. It was my official transformation from citizen to convict. My new home was an 8x10 cell shared with a man named Carlos Rodriguez, a former accounting firm partner who'd been convicted of embezzling from client trust accounts. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. On my first night, as I lay on the thin mattress staring at the concrete ceiling, Carlos shared his story. "My business partner set me up," he said quietly. "Spent 2 years moving money around, then pointed the finger at me when the auditors came calling. Sound familiar?" It did sound familiar. Too familiar. Carlos had trusted his partner the same way I'd trusted David, and that trust had been weaponized against him. We weren't the only ones. The federal system was full of men who'd been betrayed by people they'd considered friends. The phone call with my attorney came 3 days after my arrival. Richard's voice was heavy with defeat as he delivered news that shattered what little hope I had left. Marcus, I'm sorry. The civil judgment went through. The court has ordered the seizure of all remaining business assets to cover restitution. Sullivan and Sons is finished. Everything my father had built, everything I'd expanded and improved, was gone. The equipment, the contracts, the reputation, all of it, liquidated to pay for crimes I didn't commit. The final insult was that the total seizure only covered $400,000 of the $1.2 million restitution order. I'd still owe the government $800,000 when I got out, with no assets or business to help me pay it. What about David? I asked. What's happening with David? That's the other thing, Marcus. Kellerman just made partner at his firm. The local business journal ran a story calling him a hero for exposing financial fraud. He's being invited to speak at accounting conferences about ethical responsibility. I hung up the phone and walked back to my cell in a daze. While I was learning to navigate prison politics and survival tactics, David was being celebrated as a whistleblower who'd sacrificed a lucrative client relationship to uphold professional ethics. The story was so perfectly crafted that even I might have believed it if I hadn't lived the truth. That night, Carlos found me sitting on my bunk, staring at the wall. You planning something? He asked. Planning what? Revenge? Justice? Whatever you want to call it. I can see it in your eyes, the same look I had for my first 6 months here. I thought about his question. Was I planning something? At that moment, all I felt was overwhelming despair. My life was over, my family was gone, and the man responsible was being praised as a hero. Planning implied hope, and I wasn't sure I had any left. I don't even know where to start. I admitted. Carlos smiled for the first time since I'd met him. That's where you're wrong, my friend. We have something our partners never gave us. Time to think, time to plan, time to understand exactly how they did this to us. He pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten pages. I've been documenting everything I can remember about my case. Every conversation, every document, every detail that didn't make sense at the time. You'd be amazed what you remember when you have 5 years to think about it. That conversation changed everything. Carlos became my mentor in more than just prison survival. He taught me how to transform rage into strategy, how to use the isolation and monotony of prison life as tools for investigation and planning. My first night, as inmate number 47,291, had been about despair and loss. But by the end of my first week, something else was growing inside me, a cold, calculating determination to understand exactly how David had destroyed me and to figure out how I could return the favor. The prison intake form had marked the end of Marcus Sullivan the victim. It was also the beginning of Marcus Sullivan the strategist. Prison has its own rhythm, and surviving means adapting to it quickly. By my 3rd month at McKean, I'd established routines that would define the next 5 years of my life. Wake up at 5:30 a.m. for count gym from 6 o'clock to 7:30, breakfast, then library time until lunch. Afternoons were for my job in the maintenance shop, where I taught basic construction skills to other inmates. Evenings belonged to research and planning. The prison library became my second home, and my library card became the most valuable possession I owned. The computers had limited internet access, heavily monitored and filtered, but they were enough. For basic research, I learned to navigate around restrictions, using legal research databases and public records, searches to piece together information about David's activities. What I discovered made my blood run cold. David wasn't just living well, he was flaunting his success with the arrogance of someone who believed he was untouchable. His Instagram account was public, filled with photos from high-end Vegas casinos, luxury car dealerships, and exotic vacation destinations. Each post was a slap in the face, funded by money he'd stolen from me. One photo particularly haunted me. David at a poker table at the Bellagio, surrounded by stacks of chips worth more than most people's annual salaries. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to risk it all to win big. Hashtag Vegas life, hashtag high stakes, hashtag living the dream." He'd posted it 2 days after my sentencing. Carlos helped me understand the psychology behind David's behavior. He's not just spending your money, Carlos explained. He's celebrating his victory over you. Every public display of wealth is him proving that he's smarter than you, better than you, and completely beyond your reach. The other inmates in our block became an unlikely resource network. There was Jimmy Torino, a former insurance investigator, convicted of fraud, who taught me about digital evidence preservation. Marcus Chen, a cybersecurity expert serving time for hacking, showed me how to use public databases to track financial transactions. Even the guards occasionally offered insight. Officer Patricia Wells had worked in financial crimes before becoming a corrections officer, and she'd sometimes answer my theoretical questions about forensic accounting. I started documenting everything I could remember about my relationship with David, writing detailed timelines in notebooks I purchased from the commissary. Every conversation, every meeting, every red flag I'd ignored it, all went into my growing investigation files. The handwritten notes on prison stationery became my roadmap to understanding how David had manipulated me and, more importantly, how I could prove it. The breakthrough came during my 6th month, when I discovered something that made my hands shake with excitement. While researching David's professional background, I found references to other clients who'd had tax issues around the same time as my case. 3 other business owners in the tri-state area had been investigated for tax evasion between 2017 and 2019, and David Kellerman had been their accountant. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a pattern. David was a serial financial predator who'd refined his techniques over multiple victims. The realization filled me with purpose for the first time since my arrest. I wasn't just fighting for my own vindication, I was potentially the key to exposing a criminal enterprise that had destroyed other innocent people. My daughter, Emma's first letter arrived 7 months into my sentence, and it changed everything. She was 18 now, starting college, and she'd spent months researching my case independently. Her letter was 3 pages of questions that showed she was beginning to doubt the official narrative. Dad, I've been looking at the timeline, and something doesn't make sense. If you were really hiding money from taxes, where did it go? We lost the house, the cars, everything. If you had millions of dollars hidden away, why is Mum working 2 jobs to pay rent on a studio apartment? Emma's questions validated what I'd been thinking but couldn't quite articulate. The prosecution had painted me as a criminal mastermind, who'd hidden millions to avoid taxes. But the evidence of where that money had gone was sitting in David's social media accounts for anyone to see. That night, I called Carlos over to my bunk and showed him Emma's letter. My daughter is asking the right questions, I said. She's thinking like an investigator. Carlos nodded approvingly. Good, you're going to need allies on the outside when you get out. Start building your case now, piece by piece. Document everything. When you walk out of here in 4 years, you'll be ready. 4 years felt like a lifetime, but Carlos was right. Prison had given me something I'd never had as a busy businessman: an unlimited time to focus on a single objective. While David was living it up in Vegas, I was becoming an expert in financial forensics, criminal investigation, and the art of patience. My library card had become more than just access to books and computers. It was my ticket to justice. By my 2nd year in prison, my investigation had evolved from angry scribbling in notebooks to a sophisticated operation that would have impressed any detective. My handwritten investigation notes, carefully organized on prison stationery, grown into a comprehensive case file that documented every aspect of David's criminal activities. The prison library computers became my command center for gathering intelligence. I'd learned to maximize my 2-hour daily computer sessions, using public records, databases, court filings, and business registration searches to build a complete picture of David's post-conviction activities. What I discovered was staggering. David hadn't just stolen my money, he was using it to fund a gambling addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. Casino loyalty program leaks and Nevada Gaming Commission reports showed David losing enormous sums at high-stakes poker tables. In one weekend at the Wynn, he'd lost $180,000. Another report showed him down $250,000 at the Aria over a 3-day period. The math was revealing. David was hemorrhaging money faster than he could steal it, which explained why he'd needed to frame me so completely. He couldn't just embezzle and disappear, he needed a fall guy to take responsibility for the missing funds while he continued stealing to feed his addiction. By former employees became unexpected allies in my investigation. Jenny Morrison, who'd been my office manager for 12 years, started visiting me during my 18th month. She'd been suspicious of David's behavior for years, but had never felt comfortable speaking up while I was obviously trusting him completely. Mr. Sullivan, there were so many red flags, she told me during one visit. David would come in on weekends when no one else was there. He'd have meetings with contractors I'd never heard of. And those invoices, some of them were for companies that didn't even have working phone numbers. Jenny's observations filled in crucial gaps in my timeline. She remembered David staying late to reconcile accounts during the exact periods when money was being moved into his shell company. She recalled suspicious phone calls where David would speak in hushed tones and immediately hang up when anyone approached his office. Most importantly, Jenny had kept copies of questionable invoices. That had bothered her. She'd stored them in her personal files, thinking she might need them someday to protect herself if questions arose. Those invoices would eventually become smoking gun evidence, but I didn't know that yet. Through careful questioning during phone calls and visits, I learned that other former employees had similar suspicions. Mike Rodriguez, my foreman, remembered David asking detailed questions about project costs and timelines that seemed beyond normal accounting curiosity. Lisa Chen, our payroll specialist, recalled David insisting on handling certain vendor payments personally rather than through normal channels. The pattern was clear. David had been studying our operations for years, identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities for theft. He'd been planning this crime for far longer than the prosecution had alleged, which meant there was a much larger paper trail than anyone realized. My most significant breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Tony Marcelli, an inmate serving time for running an illegal gambling operation, overheard me discussing David's Vegas activities during recreation time. Tony had connections throughout the casino industry and offered to make some inquiries through his contacts. "Your boy Kellerman is well known in certain circles," Tony reported back a week later. "Word is he's into some dangerous people for serious money. My guy at the Bellagio says David's been cut off from credit at most major casinos because he's such a bad risk." This information suggested that David's gambling debts might be even larger than his known losses. If he owed money to the wrong people, it would explain his increasingly desperate behavior and his need to maintain appearances of success while secretly bleeding money. I started mapping David's social media posts against known casino events and poker tournaments. His photos showed him at high-stakes games during specific dates, and cross-referencing those dates with Nevada gaming records revealed a pattern of consistent losses that totaled well over $1 million in the 2 years since my conviction. The most damning evidence came from David's own arrogance. His social media presence was so extensive and detailed that it created a virtual diary of his activities. Photos were geotagged, timestamps revealed his location at specific moments, and his captions often mentioned amounts won or lost. He was essentially documenting his crimes for anyone smart enough to connect the dots. By the end of my second year, my investigation notes filled 3 complete notebooks and a dozen manila folders. I had timelines, financial records, witness statements, and photographic evidence that painted a clear picture of David's criminal enterprise. What I didn't have yet was a way to act on this information. That would change when I received an anonymous letter that would transform my understanding of just how extensive David's crimes really were. The anonymous letter arrived on a Tuesday morning during my 28th month in prison. The guard handed it to me during mail call, and something about the weight of the envelope suggested it contained more than a typical correspondence. The return address was Generica Post Office Box in Philadelphia, but the contents would revolutionize my understanding of David's crimes. "Mr. Sullivan," the letter began, "you don't know me, but I know what happened to you because the same thing happened to my husband. David Kellerman destroyed our family just like he destroyed yours, and I think it's time someone stopped him." The letter was from Patricia Hawthorne, whose husband Richard had owned a successful plumbing supply business in Delaware. According to Patricia, David had been Richard's accountant for 6 years before orchestrating an identical scheme embezzling money through fake invoices and shell companies, then framing Richard for tax evasion when the theft was discovered. Richard died of a heart attack 3 months into his prison sentence, Patricia wrote. He couldn't handle the stress of being branded a criminal when he'd never hurt anyone in his life. David Kellerman killed my husband as surely as if he'd put a gun to his head. The letter included photocopies of documents that made my hands shake, bank records, showing transfers to the same shell companies David had used to steal from me, fake invoices with identical formatting and language, even some of the same fictitious vendor names. David wasn't just a criminal, he was a serial predator who'd refined his techniques. Across multiple victims, Patricia's letter included contact information for 2 other families, the Brennans in New Jersey, whose restaurant chain had been bankrupted by David's schemes, and the Kowalskis in upstate New York, whose manufacturing business had been similarly destroyed. All four families had lost everything to the same accountant using identical methods. The pattern was breathtaking in its audacity. David would target successful business owners who were too busy to closely monitor their finances. He'd gain their complete trust over several years, gradually assuming more financial responsibility until he had total control. Then he'd systematically steal while creating fake documentation that would eventually frame his clients for the crimes. What made David's scheme particularly effective was his understanding of the legal system. He knew that business owners who discovered large discrepancies in their accounts would immediately contact their accountant for explanations. By positioning himself as the whistleblower who discovered the fraud, David appeared to be the victim, rather than the perpetrator. The anonymous letter also revealed something even more disturbing. David's accounting firm might have been complicit in the scheme. Patricia mentioned that other partners at Kellerman and Associates had similar clients who'd faced tax problems. The firm's senior partner, James Kellerman, David's uncle, had a history of disciplinary actions from the state accounting board that had been quietly settled without public disclosure. This wasn't just individual criminal behavior, it was potentially an organized criminal enterprise, operating under the cover of a legitimate accounting practice. The firm would identify wealthy clients, assign them to David for the theft operation, then distance themselves when the schemes were exposed. David would claim he was acting independently, protecting the firm from liability while taking a smaller fall than he would face for his true crimes. I immediately began researching Kellerman and Associates, using the prison library computers to dig into the firm's client list, disciplinary history, and financial records. What I found supported Patricia's suspicions. The firm had an unusually high number of former clients who'd faced tax problems, and several of those clients had been represented by the same criminal defense attorneys, suggesting a pattern of referrals that might indicate advance knowledge of coming prosecutions. The most shocking discovery came when I cross-referenced the firm's insurance claims with the timeline of client prosecutions. Kellerman and Associates had filed professional liability claims for client fraud. In each case where David's victims were prosecuted, they'd collected insurance payouts for losses allegedly caused by their clients' criminal behavior, essentially getting paid twice for David's thefts. My investigation notes expanded to include detailed profiles of David's other victims. Richard Hawthorne had died in prison, destroyed by the stress of false accusations. The Brennans had lost their family restaurant and were working minimum-wage jobs to survive. The Kowalskis had declared bankruptcy and moved in with relatives after losing their manufacturing business and family home. David's crimes weren't just financial, they were destroying families and ruining lives across multiple states. The scope of his criminal enterprise was far larger than anyone realized, including the prosecutors who'd convicted me based on his testimony. The anonymous letter became my roadmap for understanding the true extent of David's crimes, but it also created a moral imperative. I wasn't just fighting for my own vindication anymore. I was potentially the only person in a position to expose a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed multiple families and would continue destroying them until someone stopped it. Patricia Hawthorne's letter ended with a plea that haunted my dreams. My husband died believing he was a criminal. Please don't let David destroy anyone else the way he destroyed us. You're the only one who might be able to stop him. The weight of that responsibility was overwhelming, but it also gave me renewed purpose. David thought he'd buried me in prison, where I couldn't threaten his empire. He had no idea that his anonymously concerned victim was about to become his most dangerous enemy. Emma's visit during my 32nd month in prison was different from any we'd had before. She walked into the visitation room with the confidence of a young woman who'd grown up fast and the determined expression I remembered from her childhood. When she'd set her mind on something, at 21, she looked so much like her mother that it took my breath away, but the steel in her eyes was pure Sullivan. "Dad, we need to talk about your case," she said, pulling out a thick folder before she'd even sat down. I'd been doing some research. Emma had graduated from business school a year early and was working as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Philadelphia. But more importantly, she'd spent the last 18 months independently investigating my conviction using skills she'd learned in her forensic accounting classes. "I never believed you were guilty," she said, spreading documents across the small table between us. The numbers never made sense. If you'd really hidden $2.3 million from the IRS, where did it go? Our family lost everything, the house, the cars, the business. Mom's working 2 jobs just to pay rent on a studio apartment. Emma's college acceptance letter to the University of Pennsylvania's business program had arrived just before my arrest, and I'd been so proud that my daughter was following her dreams. Now she was using that education to clear my name, and I was overwhelmed with pride and guilt in equal measure. "Emma, you shouldn't be spending your time on this," I said. "You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't let my problems your problems." She interrupted. "Dad, this is our family. Your conviction destroyed all of us. Jake dropped out of high school and has been angry at the world for 3 years. Mom can barely function. And you've been sitting in here for a crime you didn't commit, while the real criminal is living like a king." She pulled out a printed timeline that was remarkably similar to my own investigation notes. Emma had documented David's activities, cross-referenced them with our family's financial timeline, and identified the same discrepancies that had convinced me of his guilt. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a section of her timeline. "David bought a $200,000 car 3 weeks after your sentencing. He posted about winning $300,000 at a poker tournament, but Nevada gaming records show he actually lost $150,000 that weekend. He's lying about everything, even his supposed winnings." Emma's research had uncovered details I'd missed, including David's mortgage records and credit reports that painted a picture of someone living far beyond his legitimate income. She'd also discovered something that made my heart race. David had been investigated by the state accounting board 2 years before my arrest for irregular client account management, but the investigation had been quietly dropped without explanation. "There's more, Dad," Emma said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I found the other families." She knew about Patricia Hawthorne, the Brennans, and the Kowalskis, but Emma had found 2 additional victims I hadn't discovered: construction company owner in Maryland and a restaurant chain operator in Virginia. Both had been convicted of tax evasion with David as the key witness, and both had lost everything while David prospered. 6 families, Dad. 6 families destroyed by the same man using the same methods. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about stopping a serial predator who's still out there destroying lives. Emma had contacted Patricia Hawthorne and the other families, building a network of victims' relatives who were working together to expose David's crimes. They'd been meeting regularly, sharing information and resources, building a case that was far more comprehensive than anything I could accomplish from prison. "We're ready to act when you get out," Emma said. "Patricia has been saving money for legal fees. The Brennans found an attorney who specializes in wrongful conviction cases. Mrs. Kowalski's brother is a private investigator who's been documenting David's activities. We have a team, Dad. We just need you to lead it." The conversation lasted 3 hours, and by the end, I understood that my daughter had become the warrior I'd never expected. She'd transformed her pain and anger into purpose, using her professional skills to build a case that could not only clear my name but stop David from destroying other families. When visiting hours ended, Emma handed me a photograph her college acceptance letter from 3 years earlier, now framed and sitting on her desk in her Philadelphia apartment. "I kept this to remind me why I'm doing this," she said. "You were so proud of me that day, Dad. I want you to be proud of me again when we bring David down together." As I watched my daughter walk away, I realized that prison had given me something unexpected: time for Emma to grow into the brilliant, determined woman she was meant to become. David thought he'd destroyed my family, but he'd actually forged us into something stronger. The college acceptance letter represented more than Emma's academic achievement. It symbolized hope, determination, and the promise that the Sullivan family wasn't finished fighting. Davy had created his most dangerous enemy by destroying the life of a man whose daughter inherited his stubborn refusal to quit. My little girl had become my greatest ally, and together we were going to bring down the man who'd tried to destroy us all. My final year at McKean was a study in controlled anticipation and meticulous preparation. The parole hearing documents I received in month 54 officially confirmed what I'd been counting down to. For years, my release date was set for September 15th, 2024, exactly 5 years after I'd first walked through those gates. But unlike my arrival, my departure would be the beginning of something rather than the end. The countdown became more intense with each passing week. I used my final months to refine the comprehensive case I'd been building against David, organizing 5 years of investigation into a presentation that would convince skeptical attorneys and investigators that my conviction had been based on perjured testimony and fabricated evidence. My volunteer work teaching construction skills to other inmates had evolved into something more meaningful than I'd initially realized. I was training men who'd made real mistakes to rebuild their lives through honest work, while I'd been imprisoned for crimes I'd never committed. The irony wasn't lost on me, but the work gave me purpose and helped other inmates prepare for their own second chances. Carlos Rodriguez was scheduled for release 2 months before me, and our friendship had become one of the most valuable relationships of my life. He'd taught me patience, strategy, and how to transform anger into focused determination. On his last night at McKean, we stayed up talking about our plans for justice. "Remember what I told you on your first night?" Carlos asked. "We have something our partners never gave us: time. You've used that time better than anyone I've ever seen. David has no idea what's coming for him." Carlos was right. While David had been living carelessly, assuming his crimes were buried with his victims' reputations, I'd been building an airtight case with the methodical precision of someone who had nothing but time to get every detail right. My investigation had evolved from angry scribbling to a sophisticated operation that would have impressed any federal prosecutor. Sarah's first visit in over 3 years came during my final 6 months. She looked older, worn down by years of working multiple jobs and dealing with the social stigma of being married to a convicted felon. But there was something different in her eyes, a cautious hope that hadn't been there since my arrest. "Emma showed me everything she's been working on," Sarah said quietly. "The evidence, the other families, the pattern of crimes. Marcus, I'm sorry. I should have believed you. I should have fought for you instead of running away." Our conversation was awkward and painful, but it was also healing. Sarah had filed for divorce during my trial because she couldn't handle the pressure and truly believed I might be guilty. Now, faced with overwhelming evidence of my innocence, she was dealing with guilt that matched my own years of anger. "I want to help," she said. "When you get out, I want to be part of bringing him down, if you'll let me." The prospect of family reconciliation added another layer of motivation to my quest for justice. David hadn't just stolen my money and my freedom, he'd nearly destroyed my marriage and traumatized my children. But families can be stronger after surviving trauma together, and the Sullivans were about to prove that truth. My final months were consumed with finalizing every detail of my post-release strategy. Emma visited monthly, bringing updates on her investigation and the growing network of David's victims. The Brennans had hired the wrongful conviction attorney Emma had mentioned. Patricia Hawthorne had been documenting David's continued gambling activities. Mrs. Kowalski's private investigator brother had compiled photographic evidence of David's lifestyle that directly contradicted his claims of modest income. The most significant development came through Tony Marcelli's casino connections. Word from Vegas was that David's gambling debts had become serious enough that he was avoiding certain establishments entirely. His social media posts had become less frequent and more carefully staged, suggesting he was trying to maintain appearances while his financial situation deteriorated. "Your boy is running scared," Tony reported. "My contacts say he's been asking about debt consolidation and offshore accounts. He knows something's coming." David's apparent paranoia suggested that our investigation hadn't been as invisible as I'd hoped, but it also indicated that pressure was building. A confident criminal doesn't start looking for escape routes unless he senses danger. The psychological preparation for release was as important as the strategic planning. I'd entered prison as a broken man who'd lost everything to betrayal. I was leaving as someone who understood exactly how to dismantle the life of the person who'd betrayed me. The transformation was complete, and David Kellerman had no idea that his greatest victim had become his most dangerous enemy. My parole hearing documents represented more than bureaucratic paperwork, they were my ticket to the confrontation. I'd been planning for 5 years. David thought sending me to prison had ended our relationship. He was about to learn that it had only been an intermission before the real reckoning began. The countdown was almost over, and justice was finally within reach. The world that greeted me on September 15, 2024, was simultaneously familiar and alien. 5 years in prison creates a strange time warp. Everything looks smaller than you remember. Technology has evolved in ways that make you feel ancient, and the simple act of choosing what to eat for breakfast becomes overwhelming after years of institutional routine. Emma was waiting outside the gates at 8:17 a.m., exactly when the prison had told her I'd be released. She looked professional in her business suit, but her smile was pure little girl excitement as she hugged me for the first time in 5 years without a corrections officer watching us. Double quotes. "Ready to get your life back, Dad?" she asked, leading me to a car I didn't recognize. "Whose car is this?" I asked, settling into passenger seat that felt impossibly luxurious after years of hard plastic chairs. "Mine. I've been saving every penny for 3 years. It's not much, but it's reliable." Emma's pride was evident. and I felt a surge of admiration for the woman my daughter had become while I was locked away. The drive to Emma's apartment in Philadelphia took 90 minutes, and I spent most of it staring out the window at a world that had continued evolving without me. New businesses, updated storefronts, different car subtle changes that reinforced how much time I'd lost to David's lies. Emma's apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a converted warehouse, but she'd turned it into a command center for our investigation. One entire wall was covered with timeline charts, photographs, and document copies organized with the precision of a federal prosecutor's office. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "This is where we've been building the case," Emma said, gesturing to what she called the war room. "Everything we need to destroy David is right here." My first stop was the bank, where the reality of my situation hit with devastating clarity. My bank account statement showed a balance of $847.23. The remainder of my prison commissary account and the small amount Emma had deposited from selling some of my personal belongings. 5 years earlier, I'd been worth over $2 million. Now, I had less money than most teenagers. "It's temporary, Dad," Emma said, watching my face as I stared at the pathetic balance. "When we expose David, the restitution order will be reversed, and you'll get everything back with interest." The next step was meeting with Daniel Morrison, the attorney specializing in wrongful conviction cases that Emma had contacted months earlier. His office was in a converted brownstone near the university, and his reputation for taking on impossible cases had made him something of a legend among defense attorneys. "Mr. Sullivan," Morrison said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to dealing with men who'd been broken by the system, "your daughter has presented me with one of the most compelling wrongful conviction cases I've ever seen. The evidence she's compiled is extraordinary." Morrison had been reviewing our investigation for months, and his assessment was both encouraging and sobering. We had enough evidence to file motions for a new trial. But proving David's perjury would require evidence that could only be obtained through federal investigation evidence we'd need to convince prosecutors to pursue despite their investment in my original conviction. "The challenge isn't proving David lied," Morrison explained. "The challenge is convincing prosecutors to admit they convicted an innocent man based on perjured testimony. District attorneys don't like admitting mistakes, especially mistakes this big." Morrison's strategy was elegant and aggressive. Rather than immediately filing appeals that could take years to resolve, we'd present our evidence to federal prosecutors as a new criminal case against David. If we could convince them that David had committed multiple felonies across state lines, they'd be motivated to investigate regardless of what it meant for my conviction. "We're not asking them to admit they were wrong," Morrison said. "We're asking them to prosecute a serial criminal who happened to frame you as part of his scheme." It's a subtle but important distinction. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and by the end, I understood that Emma had assembled a legal team that was every bit as sophisticated as the prosecution that had convicted me. Morrison had already identified the federal prosecutor most likely to be interested in a case against David, someone with a reputation for pursuing complex financial crimes and a track record of taking on politically sensitive cases. That evening, sitting in Emma's apartment and looking at 5 years of investigation spread across her wall, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my arrest. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to fantasy, but the solid confidence of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done and had the tools to do it. My bank account statement might have shown $847.23, but the real accounting was more complex. I had a brilliant daughter who'd sacrificed years of her life to clear my name. I had a legal team that understood the system and knew how to use it. I had evidence that could expose a criminal conspiracy spanning multiple states and victims. Most importantly, I had something David had never possessed, the unshakable conviction that comes from being completely, absolutely right. The numbers in my bank account would change. The number of days until David Kellerman faced justice would only get smaller. 3 weeks after my release, I met Susan Chen, the forensic accountant who would become the architect of David's downfall. Emma had researched dozens of candidates before settling on Chen, whose reputation for unraveling complex financial frauds was matched only by her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to present technical evidence in ways that juries could understand. Chen's office was a testament to organized precision: multiple computer monitors, filing systems that looked like they belonged in a government facility, and walls covered with flowcharts that mapped money movements through labyrinthine corporate structures. She was exactly what we needed to prove David's crimes with mathematical certainty. "Mr. Sullivan," Chen said, reviewing the evidence Emma had compiled. "Your daughter has done remarkable work, but to build a prosecutable case, we need to trace every dollar David stole and document exactly how he moved it through his various accounts and shell companies." The digital evidence files Chen created over the next month were devastating in their thoroughness. Using bank records, tax filings, and corporate documents Emma had gathered, Chen reconstructed David's entire criminal enterprise with forensic precision. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated operation that had stolen over $4.20 million from 6 different victims over 8 years. David's method was consistent across all his victims. He'd create shell companies with names similar to legitimate vendors, establish bank accounts using fake business documentation, and then submit invoices for services that were never provided. The money would flow from his clients' accounts into his shell companies, then immediately transfer to his personal accounts or directly to casinos where he'd gamble it away. "Look at this pattern," Chen said, pointing to a computer screen showing transaction records. Every time David made a large withdrawal from one of his shell companies, casino records show him making deposits at Vegas establishments within 4 hours. He wasn't even trying to hide the money trail, he was just gambling it away as fast as he could steal it. The forensic analysis revealed something that made my blood boil. David had been stealing from me for over 4 years before I was arrested, not the 3 years alleged in my prosecution. He'd started small, testing whether I'd notice minor discrepancies, then gradually increased the amounts as he realized how completely I trusted him. Chun's investigation also uncovered David's biggest mistake. He'd never reported the stolen money as income on his personal tax returns. While he'd been framing his victims for tax evasion, he'd been committing massive tax evasion himself. The IRS could potentially charge him with owing back taxes on over $4 million in unreported income, plus penalties and interest that would exceed $2 million. "This is actually better than we hoped," Chen explained. "Tax evasion is a federal crime with serious penalties. If we can prove David failed to report stolen money as income, he's facing the same charges he helped bring against you, except his exposure is much larger." The evidence Chen compiled filled 12 binders and included documentation that would be irrefutable in court. Bank records, wire transfer confirmations, casino transaction logs, social media posts with timestamps and geolocation data, and corporate filings that proved David had created fictional companies for the sole purpose of facilitating theft. But the most damning evidence came from David's own digital footprint. Chen had discovered that David used the same computer and email accounts for both legitimate business and criminal activities. His email archives, obtainable through court order, would contain communications with banks, casinos, and corporate registration services that would document every aspect of his crimes. "Digital evidence is beautiful," Chen said with the satisfaction of someone who understood that technology makes lying increasingly difficult. David thought he was being clever by using multiple shell companies and accounts. But every transaction left an electronic trail. We can prove when money was stolen, where it went, and exactly how much he spent on gambling. Emma had also been working with Patricia Hawthorne and the other victims' families to compile a comprehensive victim impact statement. 6 families had been destroyed by David's crimes, with total losses exceeding $4 million when legal fees, lost businesses, and destroyed reputations were included. Richard Hawthorne had died in prison. The Brennans had lost their family restaurant that had been in business for 3 generations. The Kowalskis had declared bankruptcy and lost their home. Each family's story was documented with the same precision Chen had applied to the financial evidence. "This isn't just about money," Emma said as we reviewed the victim statements. "David destroyed families. He killed Mr. Hawthorne as surely as if he'd shot him. Prosecutors need to understand that this was a crime spree that ruined lives across multiple states." Morrison had been using Chen's evidence to approach federal prosecutors, and the response had been more positive than we'd dared hope. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, ironically, the same prosecutor who'd convicted me, had agreed to review our evidence for potential prosecution of David. "The irony is perfect," Morrison said during our strategy meeting. "Walsh built her reputation prosecuting me based on David's testimony. Now she has the opportunity to prosecute the real criminal and correct her mistake at the same time." The digital evidence files Chen had created represented 5 years of stolen life, condensed into irrefutable proof of David's guilt. Every transaction, every lie, every family destroyed was documented with the precision that only modern forensic accounting could provide. David had used technology to facilitate his crimes. But technology would also be his downfall. The same digital trails he'd created while stealing and gambling would become the rope that hanged him in federal court. After 8 months of freedom, I finally had what I'd been working toward for 5 years: proof that could destroy David Kellerman and restore my name. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The casino surveillance footage from the Bellagio arrived on a Thursday morning in November, delivered by Patricia Hawthorne's private investigator brother with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence at a murder trial. The high-definition video showed David Kellerman losing $347,000 over 3 days in March 2020. Money stolen from my business accounts while I was serving my 2nd year in prison for his crimes. "This is it," Morrison said, reviewing the footage on his office computer. "This is the smoking gun that proves David was gambling away stolen money while testifying about your supposed crimes." The video was devastating because it was time-stamped and geographically verified. David had testified under oath that he lived modestly on his accountant's salary and had no knowledge of where the missing money had gone. But here he was, captured in 4K resolution, betting amounts that exceeded his entire annual salary on single hands of poker. Morrison had been building toward this moment for months, using Chen's financial evidence to convince federal prosecutors that David Kellerman was a serial criminal who'd escaped justice by framing his victims. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had finally agreed to review our evidence, and Morrison believed we had enough proof to secure criminal charges. "We're going to confront David directly," Morrison announced during our strategy meeting. "We'll present the evidence at his office, with his law partners present, and give him one chance to confess before we take everything to the federal prosecutors." The confrontation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Kellerman and Associates, the same office where I'd first signed the business partnership agreement that had ultimately destroyed my life. Emma insisted on being present, along with Morrison and Chen. We were walking into the lion's den, but we were carrying weapons that could tear it apart. The reception area of Kellerman and Associates looked exactly the same as it had 15 years earlier: mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an atmosphere of understated prosperity. But now I understood that the prosperity was built on theft, fraud, and the systematic destruction of innocent families. David emerged from his office looking confident and relaxed, apparently expecting a routine business meeting. He'd gained weight over the past 5 years, and his expensive suit couldn't quite hide the soft appearance of someone who'd been living too well. When he saw me, his face went through a remarkable transformation: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally, a carefully controlled mask of professional composure. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand as if we were old friends meeting for lunch. "I heard you were released. I hope you're doing well." The audacity was breathtaking. This man had stolen my money, destroyed my family, and sent me to prison, and he was greeting me like nothing had happened. I ignored his outstretched hand and looked him directly in the eye. "We need to talk, David, you, me, your partners, and the evidence of your crimes." The conference room filled quickly. James Kellerman, David's uncle and the firm's senior partner, looked nervous as Morrison arranged evidence binders on the polished table. Sarah Kellerman, no relation, the firm's other partner, appeared confused about why a convicted felon was in their office making accusations. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, "my client has evidence that David Kellerman has been operating a criminal enterprise that has defrauded multiple clients over the past 8 years. Morrison's presentation was methodical and devastating. Bank records showing transfers to shell companies, casino surveillance footage documenting gambling with stolen funds, tax records proving David had failed to report millions in stolen income, victim statements from 6 families whose lives had been destroyed." David's face grew paler with each piece of evidence, but he maintained his composure until Morrison played the casino surveillance footage. Watching himself lose $347,000 in a single weekend, money stolen from accounts he'd claimed were legitimately managed, finally broke his "This is all taken out of context," David said, his voice shaking slightly. "Those casino visits were funded by legitimate winnings from other games. The shell companies were legitimate business entities. Marcus is a convicted felon trying to." "David," I interrupted, standing up and walking around the table to face him directly. "I know everything. Every theft, every lie, every family you destroyed. I spent 5 years in prison documenting your crimes, and now I have proof that will send you to the same place you sent me." The room went silent. David's partners were staring at the evidence with growing horror, realizing that their firm was potentially liable for millions in damages and criminal prosecution. David himself was cornered, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "I want you to confess," I said. "I want you to admit that you stole my money, framed me for your crimes, and perjured yourself in federal court. I want you to acknowledge that you destroyed my family and killed Richard Hawthorne with your lies." David looked around the room at his partners, at the evidence, at the video footage of his crimes, and finally back at me. For a moment, I thought he might actually confess, might finally accept responsibility for the devastation he'd caused. Instead, he did what sociopaths do when cornered. He tried to manipulate his way out. "Marcus, we can work something out. I can make restitution. We can settle this privately without involving prosecutors. Think about your family. Do you really want to put them through another trial?" It was the wrong thing to say. The suggestion that I should protect my family from the consequences of his crimes after what he'd put us through was too much. I leaned across the table until our faces were inches apart. "David, you're going to prison. The only question is whether you confess now and show some remorse, or whether you force us to destroy you in federal court the same way you destroyed me." The casino surveillance footage had given us irrefutable proof of David's crimes, but the confrontation revealed something even more valuable. David Kellerman was exactly the same arrogant sociopath he'd always been, incapable of genuine remorse, and convinced he could lie his way out of any situation. He was about to learn how wrong he was. David's arrest came exactly 72 hours after our confrontation at his office. I was having coffee with Emma when Morrison called with news that would change everything. David Kellerman was arrested this morning on federal charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, and perjury. The FBI raided his home and office at 6 a.m. The media coverage was immediate and overwhelming. David's mugshot appeared on every local news station, accompanied by reports describing him as the accountant who framed his clients and a serial financial predator who destroyed families across multiple states. The same reporters who'd covered my conviction with headlines about greedy businessmen were now telling the real story. Emma and I watched the news coverage from her apartment, seeing David's perp walk replayed endlessly as reporters detailed the scope of his crimes. The contrast with my own arrest 5 years earlier was stark, where I'd been confused and devastated. David looked angry and defiant, glaring at cameras like someone who'd been personally wronged by being held accountable for his actions. "How does it feel, Dad?" Emma asked as we watched David being led into the federal courthouse in handcuffs. "Empty," I said, surprising myself with the honesty. I thought I'd feel vindicated or satisfied, but mostly I just feel sad for all the time we lost. The guilty plea agreement that David signed 2 weeks later was everything Morrison had hoped for and more. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, David had no choice but to accept responsibility for his crimes and cooperate with prosecutors. The document was 12 pages of detailed admissions that read like a confession to systematic evil. David acknowledged stealing $4.2 million from 6 different clients over 8 years. He admitted to creating fake invoices, establishing shell companies for money laundering, and perjuring himself in federal court during my trial. Most importantly, he acknowledged that I had been completely innocent of the charges for which I'd been convicted. Mr. Sullivan had no knowledge of my criminal activities. David's statement read, "I systematically deceived him and manipulated the evidence to make him appear guilty of crimes I had committed. My testimony against Mr. Sullivan was false, and I deeply regret the harm I caused to him and his family." The words felt surreal after 5 years of prison and another year of investigation. David Kellerman, the man who'd destroyed my life with such calculated precision, was finally admitting what I'd known all along. Guy was completely innocent. David's sentencing hearing 3 months later was a moment of pure catharsis. Morrison had arranged for all of David's victims' families to provide impact statements, and the judge listened with growing anger as speaker after speaker described the devastation David had caused. Patricia Hawthorne spoke about her husband's death in prison, her voice steady but her hands shaking as she described a man who'd died believing he was a criminal. The Brennans talked about losing the family restaurant that had been their legacy for 3 generations. The Kowalskis described their bankruptcy and the loss of their family home. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly at David, who was sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller and more pathetic than I'd ever seen him. David Kellerman stole more than money from me, I said. He stole 5 years of my life, 5 years with my children, 5 years of my marriage. He nearly destroyed my family and killed an innocent man with his lies. But also taught me something valuable, that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that the truth always finds a way to surface. The judge sentenced David to 8 years in federal prison, 1 year longer than my original sentence, plus restitution of $4.2 million to his victims and $2.10 million in penalties to the IRS. He would serve his time at the same facility where I'd been imprisoned, and I took some satisfaction in knowing that David would experience the same humiliation and loss of freedom he'd imposed on me. But the most satisfying moment came when the judge announced that my conviction would be vacated, and all charges against me would be dismissed. 5 years and 2 months after being branded a criminal, I was officially declared innocent by the same federal court system that had condemned me. "Mr. Sullivan," the judge said, looking at me directly, "the court apologizes for the injustice you suffered. Your conviction was based on perjured testimony and fabricated evidence, and you should never have spent a single day in prison." The apology couldn't give me back the lost years, but it restored something I'd thought was gone forever: my reputation, my legal status, and my right to hold my head high in public. As David was led away in shackles to begin his own prison sentence, he looked back at me one final time. I expected to see anger or defiance, but instead I saw something that looked almost like relief, the expression of someone who'd finally been caught after years of living with the constant fear of exposure. David's guilty plea agreement officially marked the end of his criminal enterprise and the beginning of his journey through the same federal prison system he'd used to destroy innocent families. Justice had finally been served, but it had taken 6 years, multiple destroyed lives, and the death of one innocent man to achieve it. The document represented more than legal vindication. It was proof that truth eventually triumphs over lies, that persistence can overcome the most calculated deception, and that sometimes the victim can become the instrument of justice. The business license for Sullivan Construction Consulting arrived in the mail 6 months after David's sentencing, and holding that official document felt like reclaiming my identity after years of being defined by someone else's lies. Unlike the original Sullivan & Sons, which had been a traditional construction company, my new venture would focus on helping other business owners avoid the financial predators who had nearly destroyed me. The consulting business emerged from conversations with other wrongfully convicted business owners I'd met through Morrison's legal network. There were dozens of them, successful entrepreneurs who'd been targeted by corrupt accountants, lawyers, or business partners who'd used their trust as a weapon against them. The common thread was always the same: trusting, busy business owners who'd delegated financial oversight to people who'd systematically betrayed that trust. "There's a real market for this," Emma said as we planned the business structure. "Small business owners want financial oversight, but they don't want to hire full-time staff. You can provide them with the expertise to protect themselves without breaking their budgets." Emma had left her job at the Philadelphia accounting firm to become my business partner, bringing modern forensic accounting skills that complemented my construction industry experience and hard-earned expertise in financial fraud detection. Together, we created a unique service construction project oversight combined with real-time financial monitoring that would make it impossible for accountants or financial managers to steal without immediate detection. Our first client was Patricia Hawthorne, who'd used her husband's life insurance money to start a small catering business. She hired us not because she suspected fraud, but because she never wanted to experience the helplessness her husband had felt when confronted with financial crimes he hadn't committed. "I want to sleep at night knowing that no one can do to me what David did to Richard," she told us during our initial consultation. "I'll pay whatever it costs to have that peace of mind." The business grew quickly through word of mouth within the community of David's former victims and their extended networks. The Brennans hired us to review their financial controls as they rebuilt their restaurant business. The Kowalskis brought us in to structure their new manufacturing venture with safeguards that would prevent future betrayals. But our most emotionally significant client was Sarah, who'd used the settlement money from our civil lawsuit against David to buy a small retail space that she was converting into a boutique clothing store. Our reconciliation had been gradual and sometimes painful, but working together on her business project was healing for both of us. "I want you to handle all the financial oversight," she said during our first official business meeting. "I need to trust someone again, and I want it to be you." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Sarah was hiring me to protect her from the kind of financial fraud that had destroyed our marriage, and I was using skills I'd learned in prison to rebuild the trust that David's crimes had shattered. Our remarriage ceremony took place on a Saturday morning in Emma's apartment, with just our immediate family present. It wasn't the grand celebration we might have planned in different circumstances, but it felt more meaningful than our original wedding 25 years earlier. We'd survived betrayal, imprisonment, divorce, and financial ruin together, and we'd chosen to rebuild rather than remain broken. "Do you take Sarah to be your wife?" the justice of the peace asked. "For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health." "I do," I said, meaning it more completely than I had the first time we'd spoken those words. The business license represented more than just legal authorization to operate. It symbolized my transformation from victim to protector, from someone who'd been betrayed by the financial system to someone who could help others navigate that system safely. Our client base expanded beyond David's former victims to include business owners who'd heard our story and wanted to protect themselves from similar crimes. We developed standardized financial oversight protocols, created early warning systems for detecting fraudulent activity, and established networks of trusted professionals who could provide services without the conflicts of interest that had made David's crimes possible. 6 months after opening, Sullivan Construction Consulting was generating more income than I'd made during my best years running the original construction company. But more importantly, we were providing a service that could prevent other families from experiencing the devastation that David had inflicted on his victims. Emma had been right, there was a real market for our expertise. Business owners who'd built successful companies through hard work and honest dealing were willing to pay significant fees for the peace of mind that came from knowing their financial affairs were being monitored by people who understood how trust could be weaponized against them. The new business license was issued to a different Marcus Sullivan than the one who'd originally started Sullivan & Sons. That man had been naive, trusting, and vulnerable to predators like David Kellerman. This Marcus Sullivan understood that trust must be earned and verified, that financial oversight was not optional, and that the price of security was constant vigilance. David had tried to destroy me, but he'd actually created something. Business owner who could help others avoid the traps that had nearly cost me everything. The speaking engagement contract arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 3 years after David's sentencing. The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants wanted me to be the keynote speaker at their annual fraud prevention conference, offering $25,000 plus expenses to share my story with 1,200 accounting professionals who needed to understand how trust could be weaponized against their clients. "It's perfect," Emma said as we reviewed the contract. "You'll be speaking to the exact audience that needs to hear your story. Accountants who could either become the next David Kellerman or the ones who prevent another David Kellerman." The irony was delicious. 5 years earlier, David had been invited to similar conferences as the ethical accountant who'd exposed client fraud. Now I was being invited to expose him and others like him to the very professional community that had once celebrated his deception. My speaking career had grown organically from my consulting work, business organizations, legal conferences and law enforcement agencies wanted to hear from someone who'd experienced financial fraud from the victim's perspective and then successfully fought back. The fees were substantial, but more importantly, each speech was an opportunity to prevent other families from experiencing what mine had endured. The transformation of Sullivan Construction Consulting exceeded my most optimistic projections. We now employed 12 people, including 3 former clients who'd become so passionate about fraud prevention that they'd joined our team. Our client base included over 200 small businesses across 6 states, and we'd detected and prevented attempted fraud in 17 cases. During our first 3 years of operation, Emma had become nationally recognized as an expert in forensic accounting, frequently consulted by federal prosecutors and private attorneys working on complex financial fraud cases. Her transformation from a grieving daughter seeking justice to a professional fraud hunter was remarkable, and I was prouder of her achievements than anything I'd accomplished in my own career. "We're making a real difference, Dad," she said during one of our monthly business review meetings. "Every fraudulent scheme we detect, every business owner we protect, it's another family that won't go through what we went through." The most meaningful speaking engagement came when Patricia Hawthorne invited me to address a support group for families of wrongfully convicted business owners. The group met monthly in a community center in Philadelphia, and the attendees were people who understood loss in ways that most audiences couldn't comprehend. Marcus Sullivan saved my family. Patricia introduced me to the group, not through revenge or anger, but through persistence and the belief that truth eventually wins. He proved that even when the system fails you, you don't have to accept that failure as permanent. Speaking to that group was more emotionally challenging than addressing auditoriums full of lawyers or accountants. These were people who'd lost everything to betrayal, who'd watched loved ones die in prison for crimes they didn't commit, who'd seen their children grow up believing their fathers were criminals. They understood the cost of David's crimes in ways that professional audiences never could, but I also had something to offer them that few speakers could provide: proof that vindication was possible, that destroyed reputations could be rebuilt, and that the truth could eventually triumph over even the most sophisticated lies. The visit to David in prison came during my 4th year of freedom, driven by curiosity rather than anger. I wanted to see what 5 years of incarceration had done to the man who'd destroyed so many lives with such calculated precision. David looked older and smaller than I remembered, his expensive suits replaced by the same orange jumpsuit I'd worn for 5 years. Prison had stripped away the arrogance and confident demeanor that had defined him, leaving someone who looked tired and defeated. "Why are you here, Marcus?" he asked when we sat down in the prison visiting room. "I wanted to see how you were handling the experience you put me through," I said. "I wanted to understand if you've learned anything from losing everything you stole from innocent families." David was quiet for several minutes, staring at his hands folded on the metal table between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, less confident than the man who'd once convinced me to trust him with everything I owned. "I think about Richard Hawthorne every day," he said quietly. "I think about his wife, about what I did to your family, about all of them. I can't sleep most nights." It wasn't the full confession and remorse I might have hoped for, but it was something. David was experiencing consequences for his actions, and the weight of what he'd done was clearly affecting him in ways that money and freedom had protected him from before. "I forgive you, David," I said, surprising myself with the words. "Not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger toward you was poisoning my own life. I'm here to tell you that I forgive you, but I'll never forget what you did." The speaking engagement contract represented more than just professional success. It was evidence that my story had value beyond personal vindication. Every time I spoke about David's crimes and my fight for justice, I was potentially preventing another family from experiencing the devastation that financial betrayal could cause. The fees I earned from speaking were substantial, but the real payment was knowing that somewhere in each audience was someone who would remember my story when they encountered their own David Kellerman, and they would ask the right questions or demand the right protections to avoid. Becoming another victim full circle meant that the man who'd been destroyed by misplaced trust had become someone who helped others understand when trust was appropriate and when vigilance was required. 5 years after walking out of federal prison, I stood in the offices of the Marcus Sullivan Justice Foundation, looking at the foundation charter hanging on the wall and marveling at how completely my life had transformed. The legal document that established our nonprofit organization represented something I could never have imagined during those dark early days of imprisonment: the ability to turn personal tragedy into systematic change that could protect other families from financial predators. The foundation occupied the entire 3rd floor of a downtown Philadelphia office building with a staff of 8 full-time employees dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted business owners navigate the complex process of proving their innocence and rebuilding their lives. We'd assisted 43 families over the past 2 years, securing exonerations for 11 innocent business owners and financial settlements, totaling over $12 million. Emma had become the foundation's executive director, using her forensic accounting expertise to identify patterns of financial fraud that could indicate wrongful convictions. Sarah managed our victim services program, helping families cope with the emotional and practical challenges of supporting loved ones who'd been falsely imprisoned. The work was deeply personal for all of us. Every case reminded us of our own journey from devastation to vindication. "Dad, look at this," Emma said, showing me a letter from the Department of Justice. "They want to fund a pilot program using our investigation methods to review potentially wrongful convictions in financial fraud cases nationwide." The federal recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it meant our work could expand beyond the individual cases we'd been handling. The DOJ pilot program would allow us to systematically review hundreds of cases where business owners had been convicted based primarily on testimony from financial professionals who might have been the actual criminals. Our success had attracted attention from legal scholars, federal prosecutors, and victim advocacy groups, who recognized that financial fraud cases were particularly vulnerable to the kind of manipulation David had perfected. Complex financial evidence was difficult for juries to understand, making it easy for real criminals to frame their victims by controlling the narrative and the documentation. The Foundation's most significant achievement came when we helped expose a conspiracy involving 3 accounting firms in Texas that had been systematically defrauding clients and framing them for the thefts. The investigation led to 17 exonerations and criminal charges against 12 accounting professionals who'd been operating a network similar to David's individual crimes. This is what we're really fighting, I told a congressional subcommittee that was considering legislation to improve oversight of financial professionals. Individual criminals like David Kellerman are dangerous, but organized conspiracies within professional firms can destroy dozens of families before anyone realizes what's happening. David's early release request had been denied the previous year, and he was serving his full 8-year sentence at the same federal facility where I'd spent 5 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was experiencing the same daily routine, the same loss of freedom, and the same social stigma that his lies had imposed on me. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about ensuring that criminals faced the same consequences they'd inflicted on their victims. Emma's engagement to Michael Chen, a federal prosecutor she'd met while working on one of our cases, represented hope for the future in ways that extended beyond personal happiness. Their relationship had grown from mutual respect for each other's work fighting financial crime, and their wedding would symbolize the next generation's commitment to preventing the kinds of injustices our family had survived. "I want you to walk me down the aisle, Dad," Emma said as we planned her wedding. "But I also want to include something in the ceremony honoring all the families we've helped through the Foundation. This isn't just about our personal happiness, it's about celebrating how far we've all come." The Foundation charter on my office wall was more than legal documentation, it was proof that destroyed lives could be rebuilt stronger than before, that personal tragedy could become the foundation for systematic change, and that victims could become the instruments of protection for future potential victims. Our work had evolved beyond just helping individual families to creating systemic changes in how financial fraud cases were investigated and prosecuted. Law enforcement agencies were using our investigation protocols, legal schools were teaching our case studies, and accounting firms were implementing our oversight recommendations to prevent internal fraud. The final reflection I wanted to share was about the power of persistence and the importance of never accepting injustice as permanent. David Kellerman had calculated that sending me to prison would end my ability to threaten his criminal enterprise. He'd underestimated the determination of someone who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose except the truth. Prison had given me time to understand exactly how David had destroyed me, and that understanding had become the foundation for destroying him in return. But more importantly, it had become the basis for protecting others from experiencing similar devastation. The Marcus Sullivan Justice Foundation would continue long after my personal story was finished, helping future victims of financial betrayal and ensuring that criminals like David Kellerman faced consequences for their crimes. The Foundation Charter represented not just personal vindication, but systematic change that could prevent the next Richard Hawthorne from dying in prison for crimes he didn't commit. If you've experienced betrayal by someone you trusted with your finances, remember that justice delayed is not justice denied. Document everything, build your case methodically, and never accept that criminals are beyond the reach of consequences. The truth has a way of surfacing when someone is persistent enough to keep digging. Most importantly, remember that destroyed lives can be rebuilt, broken trust can be restored, and even the most sophisticated crimes eventually leave evidence trails that lead back to the criminals who committed them. Share your own stories of betrayal and justice in the comments below. Your experience might be the key to helping someone else avoid becoming another victim of financial predators who believe they're too smart to be caught.